Hello.
Hello.
Hi. Very good morning to you. It's about 5 to 9 here in Dubai, so we'll also say good evening to you.
It's a late night for you guys and a morning in California. But anyway, that's life.
That's perfectly fine. It's a very informal chat. It's not a TV discussion at all. So I guess that allows me to loosen up because this by far is probably the momentous occasion of my short journalism career to be face to face with someone I've idolized secretly and I've always wanted to meet.
That's very kind of you.
Thank you very much.
I know your names, and I know Isaac, but the two of you just repeat your names for me, please.
No, it's just the second guy. My name is Abhishek Sengupta.
Great.
I am from Calcutta, but there's a strange connection. I think we are 25 years apart. I went to a college across the street called Hindu College. So, I'm face to face with a Stephanian after a long time. So that's another reason why I was up for this interview today. But
right, Abhishek. Well, nobody's perfect. It's all right. We'll have to forgive your college.
Well, I'll take it from you.
Calcutta is a highly redeeming feature because it's a city I love. So I'm very glad that you're. Yeah. Where are you from in Calcutta?
Where do you live? I'm from the south. Well, now after Ganguly became one of the most successful captains, so that's my closest point of reference. So I'm just 2 stones away from Ganguly's house in Behala, a place called Behala.
So, Behala, yes, yes, of course.
Yes, south of. But I was reading up about you. I've always read up about you, and I know you've got not a remote Calcutta connection. Your father worked there for a while, I believe.
Yes, my father worked there for 11 years, and 3 of those years were my high school years. Then I went off to college and left the country to go to graduate school. So I was not there the whole time. Right. But during the 3 years, of course, I went to high school there. And then during my 3 years of college, I came back 3-4 times a year to Calcutta to be with them. So it's really a formative period of my life. And as a result, Calcutta is very much in my bloodstream.
Sure. And I'm I'm prompted to ask, did you pick up any Bengali in the process?
একটু একটু বলতে পারি কিন্তু ভালো করে বলতে পারি না.
It's like my korche Malayalam pareo.
Not bad. How did you manage that?
Well, I'm
picked up in Dubai.
Yeah, thanks to Dubai, I've tried to pick up as many languages as you can. So, yeah, I can start a conversation in about 25 odd languages. So Malayalam is one of my.
That's impressive.
Yeah.
That is impressive. I can only do that in about 6 or 7, and then I rapidly run out of continuity. So I'm very impressed.
Thank you very much. So I think that's a great starting point. So I've never spoken to you before, so I don't know if that's the right way to address you, Dr. Tharoor, or can I?
As you wish, you can call me Shashi also. I'm quite relaxed.
Shashi ji, okay. Let's go down to the Indian route. Shashi ji, of course, the reason why we wanted to talk to you is I was reading up. Your last book was in 2016. And it was obviously about the colonial times and what the British left us with. But why is it still doing the rounds in 2017? I mean, you did that speech in Oxford Union a while ago, but why is it still doing the rounds? And if I may ask, 70 years after India's independence, why are we still talking about this? Do you think we have a colonial hangover still?
Well, it's a good question because, as you know, in many cases, for example, in some of our African countries and so on, there was a more violent process to the acquisition of independence and a much sharper rupture with the colonial period. Whereas in India, we had a non-violent movement for independence followed by a peaceful transfer of power, after which in many ways the colonial state continued with minor modifications over time. So many of the trappings, whether it's the steel frame of the Raj, the civil service, whether it's the bureaucratic system, the judicial system, the courts, the administration, the bureaucracy, all of this represents a sort of steady continuity, and there's certainly no sense of recrimination or bitterness about what was there before. My argument was somewhat different. I was invited in what I thought was a routine thing, like the many other speeches that I deliver in many places, to participate in a debate on whether Britain owes reparations to her former colonies. And while I'm not a big fan of the idea of financial reparations, I thought it gave me an opportunity to lay out the case for why there is at least a moral debt to be paid. Now, as you know, I made that speech. I forgot.
You put it down.
Forgot about it. It went on the YouTube and it went viral to an extent that within the first 24 hours, some 3 million people downloaded it. And at that point, the publishers called and said, you have to write a book. And I said, don't be silly. Everyone knows this already. And he replied, no, they don't know it already, because if they did, your speech wouldn't have gone viral. You've opened the eyes of large numbers of Indians, and they need to see it in a more lasting form. That's why I wrote the book. And thereafter, the continued legs, as it were, for this issue in 2017 is a combination of two factors. One is merely publishing schedules. The book came out in India in November 16 and in Britain in March 17, in Australia only in September this month in 2017. So each new edition generates its own wave of interest, reviews, critiques, television appearances, arguments, and so on. And that's why the issue, from my point of view as a writer, has continued to remain relevant. But what is also striking, and that's the second point, is that after all, many books are published, many authors are promoting their books, and they don't get this kind of attention. So I would argue that the reason these issues are getting attention still is because people are really interested in them and concerned about them. That as these issues come up, particularly in the context of the 70th anniversary of our independence, where people are looking back at the British legacy, at partition, at the continued influence of the British Raj on our daily life, on our laws, on our penal code, all of these things, on our parliamentary system. As all of this continues, people are beginning to ask more questions, and I think better late than never. We are, in my view, very much a forgive and forget culture. So I'm saying let us forgive by all means. I am not at all one for keeping grudges or nourishing and nurturing hatreds. But let us not forget. Forgetting is the real sin, because as I often say to young people in India, if you don't know where you've come from, how will you appreciate where you're going?
It's interesting that you mentioned the forgive and forget sort of culture, because in my generation growing up, I've heard stories of how we came from East Pakistan. In fact, Bangladesh was not even born. And 1947, when the country partitioned, so we had to move from Dhaka to Calcutta. So I've grown up hearing those stories, but if I try telling that to my 6-year-old daughter, I'm sure she will make no sense of it. Are you surprised to an extent that even today, that this kind of a topic still making that buzz, 70 years on, is creating that buzz, positive or negative? I mean, the reactions have been really strong.
Yeah, I am to a great extent gratified as well as surprised, because honestly, I was a history buff right from my school days in St. Xavier's, Calcutta. I used to be one of those crackpot kids who read beyond the syllabus. I would read books that were not required to be read for the class and write my own essays. Recently, a relative found an old essay book of mine full of essays I wrote on modern Indian history for my own pleasure. They were not to be submitted to the teacher. And I think that that's part of my obsession, is that because I am so interested, I would like others to be interested too, but I'm very conscious that most people are not. So that's why I feel particularly gratified that this book has turned out to be literally my most successful book in hardback ever. It sold over 50,000 copies in hardback, which in India is quite astonishing, because normally 5,000 is all it takes to get you on the bestseller list.
Exactly, and when you look back, would you say it's an afterthought, or after the great speech that you made at Oxford, and which I'm not sure if it was planned as well?
Yeah, I mean, I have to say that that I mentioned in the preface to the book that very often you hear people making a speech about a book. It is the first time the book is a result of the speech. So there you are.
I'm very curious what exactly prompted you. I mean, of course, you were part of a debate, and the debate is, as they say, rest is history. It's so well known today. I'm not even going there. You mentioned Henry VIII wives. You started off with a reference to the wife of Henry VIII or Fifth I'm not getting that right. Okay, but that's famous. That's famous. But what exactly prompted you growing up? Did you hear stories of the British rule, or what exactly was it? Was it something deep down inside that came out after so many years?
Well, look, it's a difficult thing to say, because one absorbs knowledge where one can find it. I read widely. I followed the historical events. I looked up all newspaper archives right from my youthful days. History captivated me more than science or some of the other tech subjects that other people, young people today, are impassioned by. It's not that I was anti-tech. I'm very proud of the fact that in the days when video cameras and video recorders were invented, I was amongst the first people, always the very first in my social circle, to have these things and to know how to use them. But after a while, the appeal of things like tech didn't endure, whereas the appeal of history always did. And to my mind, when I look around and talk to people, it always surprises me that some of these things come as revelations to them. There are so many Indians growing up in India who ought to have known the bulk of what I've written, but who say that for them too, it put together facts in an unfamiliar way. And of course, Indians living abroad, for them it's a total revelation, because they don't study Indian history where they're living in England or America or elsewhere. In fact, in Britain today, you can do your A levels in history without learning a line of colonial history. So that they have buried all this under the carpet, and to that degree, I'm pleased I brought it out into the sunlight.
Right. I'm also very curious to know, you've spoken about the harm, or spoken about how the British have actually siphoned off the wealth from India. But hypothetically, do you think if the British never came to India today, where do you see India would have been? Where do you think India would have been if the British never?
Well, I mean, the argument that is often made is if it hadn't been the British, it would have been some of the European power, and that would have probably not been particularly pleasant either. I don't want to be colonized by anybody. But if, for argument's sake, none of the foreign powers had been able to come, and it was really a question of what would India have become, I think the patterns were emerging very clearly with the decline of the Mughal Empire in the 18th century, was that the Mughals had devolved authority to the people whom they had located as provincial governors, essentially, who had become Nawabs and Maharajas and Nizams and so on in their own right. Then you had the rise of the Marathas, who began conquering and spreading across much of India. The Marathas suffered a fairly major setback, of course, with the defeat at the Third Battle of Panipat in 1761 by the Afghans of Ahmad Shah Abdali. But the Afghans had no desire to rule in India. They defeated, looted, and went away. And the Marathas could well have recovered from that, but by that time the British, after Plassey in 1757, the British were expanding, and they were able to stop the Marathas in their tracks and reverse them. But I would argue that if there hadn't been any British, the logical thing we would have seen would have been a continual expansion of Maratha power. The Marathas at one point actually controlled most of the northern part of India as well as the Deccan Peninsula. The Mughal emperor was essentially a hostage of the Marathas. They kept him on his throne. They nominally and formally paid obeisance to him as the emperor of India. But in practice, his authority ceased when they told him it ceased, and he was only able to do what they allowed him to do. Now, that could have been incipient constitutionalism. You could have imagined in this situation the Maharaja, or the Mughal emperor rather, the Badshah, becoming more and more like the British Queen, with the real power being exercised by a temporal authority, in which this case established by the force of Maratha arms. And with the passage of time, with increasing authority in the part of the various provinces and so on, I could easily imagine an India, a united, undivided India, including today's Pakistan, Bangladesh, and so on. Such a country with a nominal constitutional monarch as a figurehead and a strong domestic political arrangement. I think that democracy, for example, when it swept around the world, would have reached us also. If the Marathas were ruling through tough Peshwas and the gun and the sword, they too might have faced demands for popular suffrage and vote. Who knows? Counterfactual history is essentially speculative, and anything that I guess is only as good as anything you guess. But I'm making my guess on the basis of the existing trends that were interrupted by the British conquest.
It's interesting that you mentioned how Marathas actually controlled largely the central part of India, which stretched far and wide. Don't you think you're saying that if they held sway for more than what they had? Sorry, we lost connection. We lost connection.
Can we reconnect?
We can reconnect. Sorry, I think we both got back.
Yeah, your connection was up.
Yeah, so absolutely last question. It's gone. We'll try connecting once. It's recording, no? You had any questions?
No. You have yes. Yeah, I'll ask one or two.
Okay. Shashi ji, last question from my side. So, I'm just saying, because we're talking hypothesis here, if the Marathas stayed in power, do you think we would have seen a secular India which we have for so many decades before, of course, BJP's come into power in 2014?
I believe so, because Shivaji, for example, had a large number of Muslim generals and soldiers in his ranks. He would, and his successors would still have been paying allegiance to a Mughal monarch who is, of course, a Muslim. I think the communities would have obviously been able to get along together, and there would have been a syncretic India, as there had been much before the British came. Despite the intolerant acts of some like Aurangzeb, you also had Hindu courtiers in Aurangzeb's court. You also had examples that modern historians like Gyanendra Pandey have written about, of Hindus worshipping at Muslim Sufi shrines, of Muslims helping repair Hindu temples damaged in cyclones and storms. All of these things are a part of the culture, the sort of Ganga Jamni Tehzeeb, as they call it, the syncretic culture that had evolved in those years. I was struck, for example, in my research on the British, to discover that the Muharram commemorations in Lucknow were jointly done by the Shias, the Sunnis, and the Hindus every year, until the British came and said, no, we have to do everything by the book. Muharram is a Shia festival, so the Shias have been put in charge. And it's because of that that you had the very first incidence of inter-communal strife between Shias and Sunnis in Lucknow, is because the British chose to play divide and rule there as well. So I would say that without this malign influence, we would have probably been able to manage to get along well together. There would have been the occasional riot, because that's part of our culture and part of our nature, but I think we would have been a united country and a secular one.
Sure.
Shashi, your book was well accepted. You had received a lot of bouquets and brickbats. And based on that, would you be doing a second part of this the series? Do you have any idea to go for a second?
No, because the book covers the entire period of British rule, so there is really nothing to add to that, other than to say that the period after independence, after the British left, has already been extensively documented in my other books. If you look at my India trilogy, India from Midnight to the Millennium, The Elephant, the Tiger and the Cell Phone, and India Shastra, you already have 3 books studying contemporary India in great detail and talking about the challenges of our current democracy, economy, society and culture. So my sequel, in a sense, has already been written. This is what they used to call a prequel. This is what happened before the books that I have already published.
No, what I was trying to ask you was that, since you are getting a lot of criticisms against a lot of your conclusions about the looting of India, and you are saying that there is a connection that it was because of the British Empire, or colonial, that India got united geographically, and you are criticizing that, but a lot of counter criticism is also there, and then the infrastructure development the British had created, that also you are denouncing that, or you debunking that. So based on that, the response you are receiving, do you plan, you got a lot more insights, and do you want to clarify yourself through a second book?
No, I think that the arguments and the critiques have already been answered in the book. Everything that has been said about what the British left behind has been said by people who haven't read the book carefully, because I have myself taken every single example and refuted it. Now, it's also true that there are some questions of emphasis on which people could disagree. So some have said that I have not given enough credit to the good things, which I have mentioned. I mentioned that there were good administrators who were not racist. There were people. I mentioned Sir Arthur Cotton's role in irrigating the Godavari Plains as one example, or Jim Corbett in setting up the natural parks. So there are examples like that. I'm not saying that every single Englishman was evil or that everything they did was unbelievably bad. I don't say that in the book. So the only criticism that can be made is that there were positives that are not given equal amount of space. But my book is not about a balanced treatment. My book is about making an argument. So somebody else is willing to write a book focusing only on the good things. To my mind, those good things were there, but they were done by people who were in India in service of a bad cause, the cause of oppressing a people in the interests of a country far away. So one day somebody can write a book saying what the British did for India instead of what the British did to India, and I'm sure they will find readers also. That I have no problem with. But my own arguments remain very much what they are. The only point that I could perhaps have devoted a few more lines to than I did, and which is important to acknowledge, and that arguably I have not done enough to acknowledge, is that the British rule had a very positive catalyzing effect on helping liberate the Dalit community. Now, many Dalits have said to me that, after all, you mention Ambedkar and Phule, but without the British, would they have been able to come into their own? And I would agree that I should underscore that point, that foreign rule did give them a chance to break free of conventional caste prejudice. But I also point out that in a place in India where there was no foreign rule, namely in Travancore, you had a Dalit leader like Mahatma Ayyankali, who was also able to lead a reform movement that persuaded the Maharaja to remove some of the proscriptions and prohibitions against the so-called untouchable community. So you didn't need to have the British. Ayyankali actually never went to any school, not only not to a British school. He was an illiterate man, but he was able to stand up for the values and morals on the basis of his own strength of character. And I think there is no reason to believe that the Dalit community would not have been able to produce heroes. If the British had not been there, there would have been heroes rebelling against Indian social structure. Social reform is inevitable in every society. So I would say people like Ayyankali in the Dalit community or Sri Narayana Guru in the Viva community are not products of British colonialism.
No,
and
but
therefore
Shashi,
one does not need to overstate the argument.
But they lived during the time of the colonial empire. This Ayyankali and Sri Narayana Guru lived during the colonial era.
Except that, as you know, the British were not ruling in Travancore. Travancore was a princely state.
Yeah, but still there was also. Yeah. Thank you, Shashiji, and thank you for your time. So when are you coming back?
I'm not frankly planning anything to the UAE, but I will be back in India around the middle of the month.
I would like to speak to you about something else, which I will give you a call when you are there.
Sure, you have my number here. You can call me again.
Yeah.
Have a private
about
call.
our friend.
Okay, take it.
Okay,
Thank you very much for your time.
Nice talking to you, Abhishek.
Thank you very much.
Enjoyed meeting a fellow Calcuttan. Thank you.
Sure, thank you very much.
Thank you, Shashiji. Thank you. Bye.
It was a privilege and an honor.
My pleasure. Let me know how you use this, and I'd love to see any link to whatever you guys
Sure,
do.
Yeah.
will do, will do.
Okay.
Thank you. Take
Okay.
care. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you,
Bye.
thank you.